Hi there, and welcome to this first presentation from the Popular Culture and Education Network, what we are calling Pop Ed. My name is Nicola Robertson, and I'm one of the founding members of the network. I am uploading this video as a kind of exemplar of the sorts of things that we're hoping that people will contribute as part of the network. So hopefully you might be inspired by this, or at least you might learn a little something about how popular culture and education is conceived in theory and philosophy of education, which is my particular subdiscipline. Okay, so in this presentation, I am going to argue that crime procedural dramas, things like Law and Order, which is my absolute favourite programme in the world, probably, do educate the public on the concept of justice or the myth of justice as I have explained it here. So in order to make that argument, I need to do a few things. I'm first of all going to conceptualize the myth of justice using arguments from Georges Sorel and Jacques Ellul. Then I have to argue how the myth of justice is reinforced in crime procedural dramas like Law and Order, but of course Law and Order is not the only crime procedural drama that exists out there. You might have your own particular favourite. And then I have to set out the implications of this for our understandings of education and our understandings of popular culture, perhaps. But before I do any of this, I have to determine how we come to study popular culture in education. So the way that I usually frame this is that when I am studying popular culture in education or making arguments within that framework, I can do it in two different ways. I might first of all look at education in popular culture. So this would include looking at representations of schools, colleges or universities, or teacher-student relations and other more outlandish settings. So for example, thinking about films like Mean Girls, which is quite obviously set in a school, and school is a big part of the storyline. Legally Blonde as well, which is set in a university. Again, the university forms a big part of the storyline, but also teacher-student relations in something like Star Wars between Yoda and Luke. And we can find this everywhere. It really depends on the definition of education that you want to use. I have a very specific one known as the pedagogical triangle that I like to use. Other people have other ideas. The second mode, which is the mode that I'm going to use for this presentation, is how do we use education through, or how do we educate through popular culture? So how might we be formed by the popular cultural objects that we consume? And before we even ask that question, we have to think, what would the creator intend to communicate to their audience to somehow influence them through this medium that they use? So this is the second mode is the one that I'm going to concentrate on today. I will probably upload something at a later date on the first mode because I have also looked at that quite closely. But so the question then is, how does something like Law and Order educate us or influence us? How does the creator intend to influence us through that medium? But as I said in the introduction, before we can determine whether Law and Order is indeed educating the myth of justice through its medium, we first have to decide what the myth of justice is. And I do this by framing it through the work of Georges Sorel. Now, Georges Sorel, as it happens, was not a very good person and not a very nice person. However, his theories are very useful. And as far as I can understand it, he is the original or the very first person who talked about myth beyond its supernatural leanings. So the way that we often think about myth is something that didn't actually happen. It's kind of supernatural. It's a fiction. But he determined that myths were more like a social glue, that we believe in certain things that help to keep society together. So when he sets out myths, he describes them first of all as tableaux enchanteurs, or charming slash bewitching pictures. When Sorel writes in Réflexions sur la violence, he focuses on two particular myths. One of those is the myth of the general strike, and the second one is the myth of the French revolutions. And he notes with these that we can easily see that the revolution did not resemble anything like the charming pictures that the first revolutionaries held enthusiastically. But without these charming pictures, would the revolution have succeeded? And I think he determines that it probably would not. So for a myth to be a success, it should be able to entrance people in a way that ensures they are willing to invest in it, even if the result does not necessarily match the utopian picture offered by the myth. So the revolutionaries had this picture that the world would be great, the revolution would bring about a really productive and prosperous France, but it did not lay out the violence and the death that happened on the route to that utopia. Second, the myth as tableau enchanteur must be capable of instinctively evoking feeling. Therefore, the myth should encourage an emotional reaction and does not need to appeal to rationality. We might be able to relate to this when we see certain myths being peddled over social media or even on television and film. When we see certain images, they provoke an emotional reaction. And I wonder if this is perhaps related to certain conditioning that we go through as younger people. He finally describes social myths and the perpetuation of them as all-encompassing. So it is keeping the myth together, to translate this French, that is the only important thing. Imagine if the charming pictures of the revolution had given way to the horrific reality of the death and destruction that would have predicated the utopian ideal. It's unlikely that success would have followed. In fact, if we look at contemporary France, the myths of past revolutions and the general strike are still firmly held in the public consciousness. France may be very successful at keeping the myths together at all costs. So Jacques Ellul, who came much later than Sorel, perhaps 100 years later, carries the idea of myth forward and gives a framework of myths that he suggests keeps society together. So he talked about science and history as the two foundational myths, with work, youth, nation, happiness, and hero all being children of these. So you can see that they are, science and history are very much the parents. All of the other myths below that come from both of these, so not from any particular one. And a few years ago, when I was writing my doctoral thesis, I decided to go a little further and suggested that myths like justice, religious observance, and indeed education could all take their place in Ellul's framework as children of the children, so grandchildren of science and history. The myth of justice can be somewhat closely bound to the myth of hero. The idea that there is one person or a group of people who champion right over wrong, or fair over unfair, just over unjust. Of course, what is right and wrong, or fair and unfair, are culturally dependent notions. However, this framework does not suggest the individual values ascribed to justice or any of these myths in every case, but only that societies tend to hold these myths as central. In order to justify justice as a myth, I will show now how it fits Sorel's criteria and justifies its place in Ellul's framework. So first of all, the enchanting picture. The picture that the myth of justice paints of right triumphing over wrong, and that people always get what they deserve, offers a kind of hope, but also deters people from acting in a way that the dominant culture has decided is bad. The emotional reaction when something is seen as unfair, or at least unfair to us, then there is no doubt that it can provoke anger and disappointment. It's very unlike us to see an injustice and then think, oh, that's completely fine, and give zero reaction at all. And then all encompassing perpetuation. So complex social systems are built, such as the criminal and civil justice system, and participation in this system is mandated by negative operant reinforcement, which means it's just a fancy way of saying if you don't adhere to the law, you are going to have something removed from yourself, like freedom or money if you have to pay a fine, or time if you have to do community service. Children are taught from a very young age that bad people go to prison and the police are the good guys. And things like superhero tropes come to reinforce this. So the fact that we have these social systems, very complicated social systems, means that all-encompassing perpetuation is something that we sometimes don't even notice. So Law and Order then, as the reinforcement of this myth, as the narrator says at the beginning, in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police, who investigate crimes, and the district attorneys, who prosecute the offenders. And the show intends to tell their stories. It also tends to rip from the headlines, as they say. So a lot of the stories are based on real life crimes that have happened, sort of dramatized and fictionalized for its audience. And every episode follows a procedure, a formula. So a crime is committed. If it's ordinary Law and Order, and I say ordinary Law and Order because there are so many spin-offs. If it's ordinary Law and Order, we have a homicide. If it is the Special Victims Unit, which is another very nice show, then it would be a sex crime. If it's organised crime, then there is usually some sort of drug trafficking or gang activity involved. If it's criminal intent, then it's usually the formula is actually subverted because we know who the criminal is and we're actually just following the police as they try to work out psychologically who the criminal could be. So psychological profiling. So criminal intent is a little bit of an outlier here, but the other three certainly follow the formula very closely. So when the crime is committed, the detectives investigate it and then they submit evidence of the suspected perpetrator to the district attorneys, who decide whether that person will then be prosecuted. And then if they are to be prosecuted, will they be taken to trial, or are they going to be offered a deal so that they can avoid trial and maybe still get some perceived justice? The police and the district attorneys are indeed separate groups, but as this image suggests, they are represented as standing together as a line of defence between criminals and the public. Justice is something that should very, very carefully be defended, according to this show and according to the myth. Before considering the representations contained within the show itself, the formula is important to reinforce the myth that the right kind of justice only prevails in such tightly set parameters. For example, the man who kills a friend of his son, which has happened in a real episode. So a man's son is murdered, his friend is recently acquitted of that murder, and so the man kills the friend. He is not considered to have exerted any kind of justice. Despite killing his son's suspected killer, he can't be considered to have exerted any kind of justice because it was not executed by the justice system, these police and district attorneys, even though there is some obvious poetic or even biblical justice in this case. The idea of an eye for an eye. His son died, he killed his friend. Indeed, the man who killed the suspected killer is promptly removed from the courtroom to face a formal justice of his own. So formal justice prevails. In these programmes, the police are working with the myth of justice at the forefront of their minds, it seems. The hero cops are never overtly dirty cops, although they seem to bring to account their fair share of dirty cops and colleagues. If any cop does a questionable thing, like Detective Elliot Stabler here in this picture, who often does very questionable things, especially he very much especially likes to brandish his gun at every opportunity, it's always still for the right reasons. So it's always still to see someone brought to justice, or and definitely to pay for the crime that they have committed. Or it's also perhaps to protect someone else. As such, the TV show's simulation of the internal investigations that happen when an officer discharges their weapon usually find the hero cop to be exonerated. If not immediately, then definitely they are eventually exonerated. These representations of the hero cop reinforce the idea that the police, in their commitment to keep moral and social order, are themselves trustworthy, morally upstanding, and dedicated to the same order that they enforce. In the UK, these representations are often challenged by real-life news stories of murderous and rapacious policemen. But the myth remains intact. We still need to believe that the police are doing the right thing, largely, and they intend to bring people to justice. Just like the hero cops, the hero attorneys are also represented as vigorous defenders of justice. While they may encounter corrupt attorneys in their own ranks, they're never tempted to play dirty in court in order to secure a conviction. Often they will be blindsided by defence attorneys who are routinely represented as deplorable, despicable, or duplicitous. But the prosecutors, including the iconic Jack McCoy, will only bend the rules just enough, but still within the legal parameters to make sure that the jury make the right decision as he sees it. Again, the idea being emphasised to the viewer is that the attorneys, as long as they are on the side of the prosecution, can be trusted to protect such fragile notions as justice, which in turn keeps the social order ticking over successfully. By default, if the cops and attorneys are heroes, then the offenders must be portrayed as villains. The offenders in Law and Order come from all walks of life, but by and large they share the trait of believing that they won't get caught, or they will risk their freedom in a jury trial. This offers two important representations. The first is that justice is blind, i.e. it does not see status or power as a means of circumventing it. Of course, in reality, this is definitely not the case. The second representation is that juries, i.e. the people, are as vital in the execution of justice as the heroes. Indeed, it represents an idea of the jury as ordinary heroes, which extends onto the audience watching at home. Of course, to be an ordinary hero in this case requires that the myth of justice is subscribed to as vehemently as the people as by the heroes. Presenting the jury in such a way is a vital step in perpetuating the myth. We have to know that ordinary people are also part of exerting justice. So, how then does popular culture educate justice? Well, objects of popular culture represent the world to its consumers. Just as objects of educational content represent the world for students, it's therefore not illogical to suggest that objects of popular culture also have educational merit. There are ethical implications when cultural and educational representations are given as the only view. Now, this happens often. when teachers will espouse a view of the world as the only view and will not tell students that there is a world beyond what they are being taught at that moment. What that leads to are ideas like propagandism and indoctrination, and it's important for educators and popular culture creators to understand that they are the power of their representations. Pop culture has its place in educating myths, including the myth of justice, of course. Shows like Law and Order do this in a way that is entertaining, but also in a way that perpetuates the myth without any room for critique. The mode of consumption of objects of popular culture can sometimes be more passive than when entering into an educational relation with content, and so it might be exploited by those who wish to relay a message without considering the critical engagement of the consumer. Education, to some extent, must place more emphasis on teaching students to engage critically with cultural objects to evaluate the messages being transmitted. It is not possible to educate myths, they are essential for social order. Sorry, it's not possible to eradicate myths because they are essential for social order, but a holistic hermeneutic interpretation of the world can be valuably supported when people engaging with cultural objects, especially cultural objects that are realistic in their representations, is only a singular view of a specific aspect of the world. Education must take into account the formative aspects of popular culture. And this is partly what our network seeks to encourage amongst educators and amongst popular cultural theorists. And so if you're interested in proposing some content or joining our network, then please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at the moment on Substack, on YouTube, and also you feel free to send an email, and I and some of the other founders will be happy to get back to you as soon as possible. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I should see you again very soon.